Imagine being on a battlefield where everything around you is chaos. The ground is covered with blood, the screams of the fallen echo in the air, and the enemy is using tactics so brutal, they seem impossible. These were the strategies that determined the fates of entire civilizations. Welcome to the terrifying world of ancient warfare. But what made these tactics so brutal? And what made them so effective in bringing entire armies to their knees? Today, we'll explore the most savage strategies ever used by ancient armies. Stay tuned till the end to learn about the cruel ways warriors fought and the cunning methods they used to win battles. Now, you might be thinking, ancient wars were brutal, sure, but how brutal could they really be? Well, the reality might shock you. The wars of the past were not just about fighting for land or power. They were about survival, and ancient generals knew they had to use every trick in the book to make sure their side won. From psychological warfare to using the fear of the unknown, the tactics they employed were beyond what we think of as brutal. Some were so horrific, they're hard to imagine today. So, if you ever wonder about the dark side of history, where battles were fought with merciless strategies and lives were lost in unimaginable ways, then keep watching. You don't want to miss what comes next. Let's start by understanding that ancient warfare wasn't just about the soldiers on the front lines. It was about the power of fear, surprise, and overwhelming force. The generals of the past knew that to win a battle, they had to strike fear into their enemies and make them believe they were facing forces beyond their control. These tactics were often ruthless, and the results were terrifying. From the Roman legions to the terrifying Mongols, the ancient world was filled with military strategies that made war look like a terrifying game of survival. Some tactics were designed to crush the enemy's spirit, others were meant to create chaos and confusion, and some were just meant to be so brutal. The enemy would have no choice but to surrender. Let's dive into some of the most brutal tactics that ancient armies used. The scorched earth policy. One of the most brutal tactics ever used in ancient warfare was the scorched earth policy. This tactic involved destroying anything that could be useful to the enemy: crops, homes, and even entire villages. The idea was simple: burn everything to the ground, leaving the enemy with nothing to use for survival or to feed their soldiers. The Persian Empire used this tactic against the Greek city-states. When they were invaded, they burned down their own lands to prevent the Persian army from using the resources. The tactic was used repeatedly throughout history by various armies, including the Russians in their defense against Napoleon's invasion in 1812. Imagine a landscape where everything is destroyed and you're left with nothing but desolation. This forced the enemy to either retreat or face certain starvation and loss of morale. The Roman testudo formation. When you think of the Roman Empire, you think of powerful legions. And one of their most brutal tactics was the testudo formation. This was a shield wall where soldiers would align their shields in a way that created an almost impenetrable wall on all sides. In front, on top, and around them, the soldiers would form a shield barrier, protecting themselves from arrows, rocks, and spears. This was a fearsome tactic because it allowed the Roman soldiers to advance slowly yet steadily toward the enemy while being almost completely protected. The enemy would be helpless in trying to pierce through this massive wall of shields. It was a brutal and unstoppable approach to warfare, forcing the enemy to either retreat or be crushed under pressure. The Mongol siege tactics. When we think of the Mongols, we often think of their terrifying speed and unmatched skill in battle. But what made their tactics even more brutal were their siege techniques. The Mongols were experts in psychological warfare, and they used fear to break their enemies long before the first arrow was shot. One of their most brutal siege tactics was the use of mass destruction. The Mongols would often surround a city or fortress and cut off all supplies. But they didn't just wait. They would send in a small group of warriors to pretend to retreat. The defending soldiers would chase them, only to find themselves walking straight into a trap where the main Mongol force would attack. This tactic broke the spirit of many defending armies, who realized that no matter what they did, they could never outsmart the Mongols. Another tactic involved throwing bodies of the dead over the walls of besieged cities to spread disease and create fear among the defenders. The psychological effect was enormous. No one wanted to fight when they knew they were facing an enemy that would use every brutal advantage at their disposal. The Spartan phalanx. The Spartans were known for their terrifying discipline and brutal fighting techniques, and one of their most famous tactics was the phalanx formation. In this formation, soldiers would stand shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable line of shields and spears. The front line would advance slowly, pushing back anything that came in its way, while the soldiers in the back would keep their spears ready to strike. What made the Spartan phalanx so brutal wasn't just a physical formation, but the sheer discipline of the warriors. These soldiers weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their way of life. Their fearlessness and training made them nearly unstoppable. The phalanx didn't just defeat enemies. It crushed their spirits by showing them that there was no escape from the might of the Spartans. The Persian immortals. The Persian Empire's elite fighting force, the immortals, were feared throughout the ancient world. They were called the immortals because, whenever a soldier fell, they were immediately replaced, creating the illusion of an invincible army that could never be beaten. The immortals were used for shock tactics. They would appear out of nowhere, overwhelm the enemy with speed, and then retreat before the enemy had time to organize a defense. This psychological tactic worked wonders. The constant fear of facing an army that could never be defeated made their enemies panic, and often led them to make mistakes. Their reputation alone made them a brutal force. The mere sight of the immortals on the battlefield often caused enemy troops to surrender without a fight. The Carthaginian wore elephants. Carthage, a rival of Rome, had a brutal weapon that struck fear into the hearts of the Roman soldiers: war elephants. These massive creatures were heavily armored and armed with sharp tusks or spiked blades attached to their trunks. In battle, the sight of these towering animals charging toward the enemy was enough to break the morale of even the bravest soldiers. The Romans were forced to develop special tactics to counter the elephants, but they were never fully prepared for their impact. Elephants trampled soldiers, destroyed fortifications, and caused havoc in the ranks. They were used not just as physical weapons, but also as a means of psychological warfare. Enemies were terrified of these giant creatures. So, what can we learn from these brutal ancient tactics? The key takeaway is that ancient warfare wasn't just about physical strength. It was about using every possible advantage, from fear to surprise, to outsmart and outlast the enemy. The armies that mastered these brutal strategies were often the ones who left their enemies defeated, not just on the battlefield, but mentally and emotionally. Ancient warfare wasn't for the faint of heart. It was brutal, unforgiving, and full of tactics that modern armies would consider inhumane. But these were the methods that won battles, shaped civilizations, and created legacies that still echo today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal tactics of ancient warfare, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more history insights. We got plenty more stories from the past that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.